First off, I would like to thank our organizers, particularly thanks to Susan and to David and to Sonia. And I have to really say a lot of thanks to Sonia, because in many ways I am here, and I mean like here, like right now, but also here as a person, because of Sonia and Shyla and Mary and Keith and Eddie and Frank and many others. So I'm just going to say by word of explanation, and then it'll make sense. When I think it's important for you to know the title of the work, I let you know. And when I think that it's just a kind of feeling that you should have that puts you into a space about what I'm saying, there you have it. I want to start by contextualizing three terms: modern, modernity, and modernism. So that we all stay on the same page, I will endeavor to make it clear where I'm pulling each of these terms from, where appropriate. A standard way of understanding modernity is as, quote, the cultural condition in which the seemingly absolute necessity of innovation becomes a primary fact of life, work, and thought, end quote. While by no means conclusive, from this definition we might extrapolate a sense that the experience of living in this state is to be modern, or to be able to recognize the modern in others. So, I am modern, therefore I recognize either your parallel possession of modernity or your lack of it. Though I can conceptualize the presence or absence of modernity, the lack of modernity does not actually have an equivalent term. There are only a group of terms that demonstrate the opposite of modernity as degradations or stylistic modalities, such as medieval or primitive, rather than a sufficient and proper antonym. When I hear terms like digital divide or computer illiterate, I imagine that they exist as a way to frame those outside the supposed necessary innovations that have taken over the rest of us. But I think that it might be useful to think of the modern as something that one can be both within and ignorant of, so I don't know how to use my phone, while also outside of it, but completely cognizant of it, so locked from the outside to the world of technology. I want to hold on to this sense of in and out and return to it in just a little bit. Of the three, modern, modernity, or modernism, modernism is the subsumption of the other two into a recognizable style, because it references a break, be that break with tradition, with what preceded it, or even within itself, hence the subperiodizations that exist in many fields like my own, art history, of pre, early, and late modernism. In terms of art history, the three terms are fairly equivalent with their use in other fields, save for one big difference and a few minor variances. The big difference, of course, is that when we speak of the modern, we are referencing a group of objects that occurred in a specific time, often with specific materials, usually made in a set number of ways, and more often than not in an even smaller number of places. To be a modern object is to be either a painting or a sculpture that employs some degree of technical, stylistic, or material difference between those objects that are thus not modern. Modernity is, of course, the mechanism by which these objects become modern, and modernism is the notable style in which they are shown, purchased, traded, and displayed. As Keith Moxey has critically explained, quote, modernity and its artistic partner modernism have always been tied to the star of temporal progress. The time of modernity was not only teleological, but its home lay in the West, end quote. So to be an object of modern art or to be a modern artist is to be Western. But by the same token, to be Western was to be de facto modern, even if one's object or self challenged or complicated that assumption. As a coda to the assumption of the West, the introduction of, quote, multiple modernisms sought to explain both the surprise of discovering modernity and modern objects outside the West, and to reify that same primary Western modernism as a universal truth by locating its likeness elsewhere. When modernism held up its mirror and found consistency, it was named modernity. We might look at the problematic treatment of a number of 20th century artists like Alma Thomas, Norman Lewis, Ernest Mancoba, Henry Ochoa Tanner, Jesus Rafael Soto, or Elio Ortesica, who were both pushed into and out of the categories of modernism by way of the possibility of the multiplicity. This week, I felt this issue arise once again upon seeing the Abstract Expressionism show at the Royal Academy, wherein Norman Lewis, who was so central to that movement, was once again pushed to its margins. In the show, he was relegated to one small painting, poorly hung above another painting, and lodged into a small space adjacent to the wall text, while numerous works by his peers held sway throughout the exhibition. Undoubtedly, it is the person of Lewis that continues to render his otherwise modern objects not quite modern enough. I pause here to remind you that I'm talking about the use of these terms in art history only. Why? Because there are ways that what the category of modern art and the personage of a modern artist has at stake for an art market determine the difference between the use of these terms in this field and their uses in others. While we might be able to draw our modernity widely, we must see our modernism up close and under the microscope of the commodity that is art. I want to close in on the moderns by way of two artists that have, in very different ways, set about a course of making modern art and critiquing modernism: Frank Bowling and Rashid Areen. Born and educated in Pakistan, Areen came to London in 1964, where he began writing about modernism. His writings on the subject were, in some measure, a mirror of his objects. He made loosely formal, non-representational drawings and paintings and rigid geometric sculptures. In turn, he defined modernism as tied to abstraction. But also, modernism was problematically tied to the abstraction produced in the West, specifically the European avant-gardes of the teens and 20s, the School of Paris's reliance upon African objects, and post-World War II abstract expressionist painting in America. For Areen, modernism, as a chronologic delineation, theory, or practice, was a complicated concern inextricably linked to imperialism, colonialism, racism, and classism, aka the dominance of the West. Arguably, Areen believed in the project of modernism, but not its mechanisms. For example, if late modernism is often tied to the end of the Second World War, the realignment of the former superpowers, the destabilization of colonial forces, and the advance into the Cold War, I suggest that Areen firmly believed that the omission of 1947's partition as part of this break between old and new was both a construct of order, in the Foucauldian sense, and to disregard its significance and, in turn, the import of its aesthetic relevance. In comparison to Areen, Bowling has never really written about modernism, nor has he critiqued the power relations that modern art negotiates with the modern world. What he has done instead is to actively live inside of the very modernism that concerns Areen. In a series of articles published in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Bowling attempted to do two things. First, he wanted to write about the artists that were, like him, painting abstractly in New York, and he wanted to write about them with the same kind of rigor used by the critics writing just a few years before, like Harold Rosenberg, Meyer Shapiro, and of course, Clement Greenberg. I use the term attempt here to point out that Bowling's criticism is primarily important because he was, perhaps, one of a very few Black writers contributing to mainstream art periodicals in this period, and he was largely writing about other Black male artists. Virginia Jaramillo is in fact the only female artist that I believe that Bowling has ever written about extensively. Bowling's other contribution, then, is one that sought to evaluate these artists like all other artists, not as special cases. And Bowling's personal friendship with Greenberg elided into a kind of criticism that took on the critic's own distillation of modernism. Writing in 1960, Greenberg described modernism thusly: Quote, "Modernism includes more than art and literature. By now it covers almost the whole of what is truly alive in our culture. It happens, however, to be very much a part of a historical novelty. Western civilization is not the first civilization to turn around and question its own foundations, but it is one that has gone furthest in doing so. The essence of modernism lies, as I see it," and that's Greenberg, mind you, "in the use of characteristic methods of a discipline to criticize the discipline itself, not in order to subvert it, but in order to entrench it more firmly in its area of competence," end quote. What I glean from Greenberg's words has a direct impact on how I understand both Bowling and Arene, and what they offer to the art world in the late 20th century. If, as Greenberg argues, modernism, while inescapable, is a historical novelty, then both of these artists were wrestling with a past rather than with their present. And though each sought a critical stance, it was ultimately futile, because, as Greenberg asserts, subverting modernism only serves to entrench it further. And yet, Arene is critical of modernism because of the intrusion it made into the reception of his own work, not simply as a thought experiment. Modernism was used as an explanation for why he, as a product of the non-West, could not possibly aspire to make art in the contemporary. To bring us closer to the present, what else explains his omission from the recent Tate Britain exhibition, Conceptual Art in Britain 1964 to 1979? A show whose chronologic parameters nearly twin Arene's arrival in London and his transition from object making to performance, or a move from formalism to conceptualism. Just a question, just wondering. Arene's experiences jive with Bowling's insistence on writing about artists in a manner that was out of fashion for at least a decade before he started doing it in the late 1960s. But this manner of writing still represented a path towards the mainstream. Arene rarely makes reference to Greenberg, and Bowling did so only in relation to his own art. But they are both locked within a Greenbergian tautology about modernism, the West and the rest. What I'm saying here is that Greenberg distilled a method of thinking about art that reiterated and reflected the hold that modernism had on America in the middle of the 20th century. That this view may have been stilted, idiosyncratic, and driven by the potential sale of art made it no less attractive to writer artists like Arene and Bowling, who could see its use value as both model and foil. And while I think they were firmly within the modality of their time, they ceded to the pressure that the modernist project wrought onto them. Why did they so desire to be modern when modernism itself was outmoded? I think they had to go back to recoup the modernism denied to them as subjects to function as contemporary artists. It was a necessary action. They were not stuck in history as much as they had to assume a recursive posture of back and forth that we might describe as necessarily ahistorical. As a side note, I think that the work of the Black Art and Modernism Project has knowingly delved into modernism for similar reasons, in an effort to sort out the problem of the present. My title, Modernism in the Rearview Mirror, then has two meanings. The first is that both Bowling and Arene are looking back at something that should not have been a part of their purview. And the second is that their reflexive looking back shaped the ways in which certain British artists would be viewed from the 1980s on. Arene and Bowling are useful to my argument in part because they are so heavily identified with the ways in which non-white British artists in the 20th century have been viewed. They were the first to stake a claim as writer-artists interested in their peers and in younger artists, who otherwise had no critical assessment. They set the tone for the need to write about this work, but they also modeled art criticism and curating as necessary pursuits for artists. Let me be clear. I'm not arguing that Arene and Bowling share any aesthetic similarities or affinities. One is primarily a sculptor, and the other mostly a painter. Nor would I suggest that they are artistic peers in any way other than they are roughly the same age and are known to each other. But age and geography do not peers make. Rather, I think that they represent two poles of how late modernism was realized for Black artists in Britain. If the bowling approach was to return to and replicate a critical tradition, the Arenian method was to subvert that tradition by insisting in articles and in exhibitions on its inherent inadequacy. Either way, the goal was for recognition of the objects and of the artist, without recourse to the body of the artist. As a mechanism, modernism privileged the subject, but somehow it was and it is the body of the non-white artist that become muddled with the primacy of the subject. Looking back at the art of the 1980s and 1990s in Britain, I am struck by the overlay of biography, geography, and sociology onto the objects produced. And I am sure that somehow within this thick blanket of ephemera that is allowed to become the aesthetic, the real question is about whether or not these artists are modern or have the right to claim modernity. Why else would we insist on them being practitioners of visual culture over and above them being fine artists? I laid out all of that for you in some ways to give you a sense of what I'm thinking about when I turn to artists who are working now and who are within this question, I think, of where we stand after the modern has been examined. One of the signs that this issue is the prevalence of photography in this period and the noticeable recognition of the photography of this period, often to the detriment of the other media in which artists work. That is why the most profound aspect of the work generated from the 1990s forward has been the way in which film and video and installation, or installation of film and video, have taken international precedence over either the traditional binary painting and sculpture or the documentary-driven photography of the 1980s. Put another way, perhaps, the transition to film was an avenue around the problem that modernism presented to Black British artists at mid-century. There is a line that can be drawn from some of this work in the 1980s that seems, like Hatum's here, to be so attached to the narrative of place or the body by way of sexuality or race. Yet the direct transmission of film and video works equally to undo it. Or, to return to my earlier statement that modernism muddles the subject for the body and composes the object for the market, then perhaps the collaborative nature of film and video unhinges the authorial supposition that, in the cases of painting and sculpture, always return to the body of the maker. Maybe the speed of the moving image moves too fast for these ideas to get stuck on and to take root. I'm careful here not to suggest that the crucial issues of center and periphery that plague modernism have been solved, or that our concerns about what modernism has done to static work is not also a part of time-based media's rhetoric. Moreover, I'm very mindful of what Copina Mercer describes as, quote, the nowism that regards the contemporary as a terminal moment of resolution. This has not been fixed, but something is clearly different. And that something is, I think, attached to motility and to distribution that is not wholly reliant upon the art market. That this happens through time-based media may or may not be a conjecture of happenstance. In the extended version of this research, I examined film and video within this post-studio condition, and I hope to come to better conclusions about what is happening as opposed to just presenting all of the things that seem to be happening at one time. I want to trace this line back to the 1980s, when those interested in film and video seemed to start releasing themselves from the push and pull that so heavily caught arena and bowling. Looking back onto this moment, I am struck by the way that these new mediums, neither painting nor sculpture, allowed narrative and the full ride into representation, both of which would have been anathema to the modernist project. But in looking at this from the vantage of now, I realize representation is only binary when paired with abstraction. Perhaps modernism is only a problem seen within the frame of the modern. Thank you.